Please welcome Athamos Stradis, who will talk about the
everyone. So in today's talk, I'm going to be discussing a theory of records, well, looking at explaining the record asymmetry, which is why we've got records of the past and the future. And I'm going to be looking at what might be today's leader, Albert and Loewer, and I'm going to work within the same framework. I'm going to challenge their account, and then I'm going to offer an alternative. So just as a kind of outline of where we're going to go. So this whole talk, by the way, is based on a new paper in data. So this is basically just the paper, but in my voice, I guess. And it's going to consist of, first of all, outlining the common ground between Albert and Loewer and myself, and then posting where it's going to end. Then introducing their theory and presenting what's my main objection to it. And then finally introducing my own theory and explaining how it gets rid of some of the problems with their account. And then conclusion. Okay, so the metaculus is basically, that's a framework that I'm going to be working in. It's common to Albert and Loewer and myself. And it's basically an application of classical statistical mechanics to the whole universe. Most of you have probably been in talks where this came up. I'm just going to wrap through the basic idea. So first of all, you've got the past hypothesis, which is a low entropy initial macrostate. From now on, past state, capital P, capital S. You've then got the statistical postulate, which is just a uniform distribution over that macrostate. And then you've got your fundamental dynamics, which are Newton's laws, and that just basically that makes you hit the play button. So Loewer calls this thing probability map of the universe. So that's obviously quite a grand title. So what justified that title? Well, here's the idea. When I have a statistical postulate, that gives me a distribution over those initial microstates. Because each one of those microstates kind of evolves forwards in time like a string, it gives me a distribution over those possible strings, possible microscopic evolutions of the universe. Those are macrohistories. But because each microstate, so that's a microscopic arrangement of the world's matter, because each of those corresponds to a single macrostate or macroscopic configuration of the world's matter, each one of those microhistories is going to pick out a particular macrohistory. So it's like a sequence of the universe's macrostates, which needn't be. Yeah.
Are you saying deterministic?
Oh yeah, I should add, because the time dynamics are deterministic, I'm going to assume. So each one of these is a kind of, the microhistories are these kind of deterministic lines. Yeah. So we've got this distribution of the possible macrohistories, but because each macrostate of the universe embeds the macrostates of all subsystems within it, when you think about it, that actually ends up attaching a probability to every possible event that could have happened at the initial time. So kind of looking forwards from the Big Bang, everything that is, it attaches a probability to everything that might happen. And that's not just thermodynamic phenomena like ice melting in a bucket. It's also like a probability of a rabbit breeding, getting eaten by a fox, coin tosses, you name it. So how could we explain the record asymmetry within this picture? Well, because the dynamics are time-symmetric, the only possible way within this framework is to appeal to the initial conditions. So that's the only way you could explain the record asymmetry, or for that matter, any macroscopic asymmetry. Okay, but it's one thing to kind of acknowledge that, but it's quite another to actually join the dots between the universe's initial state and things like ordinary records, like photos of the past, right? So somehow these things are linked. So it's worth asking where records fit into this picture. Well, in order to accommodate them, we need to actually update the metaculus a bit. So remember, the metaculus encodes the probabilities of all things as given at the initial time. But obviously, we, with all our records today, which are baked into the current state, by the way, we exist 14 odd billion years after the Big Bang. So to get the probabilities of events, okay, as given today, which presumably is what records disclose, right? They disclose the probabilities of events at other times. We need to update this mentaculus into mentaculus 2.0, what I call the updated mentaculus, which is just mentaculus conditionalized on the current state, capital Z, capital S. Okay. When we take all of our records together, okay, it implies that this updated mentaculus has a certain probabilistic structure, which I'm going to call the density asymmetry. And the idea is that the updated mentaculus is dense over relatively few past macrohistories, or maybe even just one macrohistory of the world. So that's a macrohistory in which dinosaurs roamed the Earth, the Romans invaded Britain, and so on and so forth. But it's pretty diffuse over many possible future macrohistories, right? Trump could win the next election. It could be Biden. I might live to when I'm 70 to when I'm 80. They've all got like a fighting chance, right? But only one past macrohistory has a fighting chance of being true. So the question is, how does this relate to the record asymmetry? So here I'm going to signpost. This is where Albert and Loewer I'm going to take a different stance to them. They think that the density asymmetry, so this large-scale probabilistic asymmetry, explains the record asymmetry. But I take the opposite view. I think that the record asymmetry explains the density asymmetry. They go from big to small. I go from small to big. Okay, so that's part one covered. Oh, and here's a picture of the mentaculus. So you can see that in these coordinates here, x and y, that there is phase space. Time is the z-axis, and these big blocks projected upwards in pastel are macrostates. And the little blue blocks, the tiny ones, are microstates. So over time, the initial probability distribution kind of fibrillates through phase space. It spreads out, okay? And so you can see that, different macro histories, say the X path and the Y path, they were kind of each reasonably probable at the initial time. But imagine you've got your eyes shut and then you just kind of open them at time t3 and you observe the universe to be in macro state y3. What that basically does is it means you discard all these other microstates which are floating in space. You're only left the ones which are within y3. Now, most of the little squares that end up in y3, you can imagine that they would have got there via the y intermediaries, y0, y1, y2. Now, there might be the odd rogue, like this red one, whose shadow I've drawn down here, which gets into y3 by this kind of sneaky x route, but ones like that are just going to have a very, very small measure.
Yeah. So when you had the current state,
yeah,
is that the macro state or the micro state?
Oh, the current state is the current macro state. Yeah, yeah. So that's like y3 up there. Yeah. So the updated mentaculus basically means that once we've ditched all the microstates which are floating in space, looking backwards, the vast majority will be concentrated along the y intermediaries, not the x intermediaries. That's just like the rogue red one. But looking forwards, there's no particular preference for the x or y path. That's the updated mentaculus. That there is the density asymmetry that I just explained. Okay, so here's Albert and Loewer's theory of how records work. They use a theory of records which was developed by David Walker in the 90s, but here's the basic idea. Suppose we observe some record in the present at t3, okay, like a footprint. How do we infer some past event at t2, for instance, a stroller? Well, this much is clear. Whatever else is true, that footprint needs to have started out in what they call a ready sync, which is like an appropriately calibrated state at an even more remote time, t1. Why? In this case, that's a flat beach. Why is that necessary? Well, because if the sand was pre-imprinted at t1, well then it would be a bogus record of a stroller because it would have been imprinted all along, right? So yeah.
Is the stroller just like a person strolling?
Yeah. Not just bowling.
I'm getting confused with like a pram.
right. Yeah. Some random person.
Yeah. Sorry.
What's wrong with that? So that's a kind of prerequisite. But this kind of, so far, this situation looks symmetric, right? I've just said it needs to be more temporally remote, which raises the question of why can't we have future ready states, let's say at T5, remember we're at T3, why can't I have a future ready state which allows me to infer something in that temporal direction, i.e. at T4, right? It looks so far, nothing seems to break the symmetry. Well, in order for a ready state to do its job, it's going to be no use to us in the present if we have no way of knowing that it obtained, right? We have to know that the beach was flat in some kind of way in order for it to do its job of acting as a ready state. So the idea is we require some epistemic access to these ready states in order for them to be ready states. So how is this possible? What means that we have access to the ready state at T1, but we can't have similar access to a ready state at T5? Well, Albert and Loewer's answer is that we have yet another ready state. Sorry, yet another record of that ready state. So in this case, with the flat beach, right, let's say we have, for instance, a polarized photo of that flat beach, or it could even be light leaving the sand, whatever. Okay, so that's what makes it a ready state. We've got a record of that. But you can see that there's an infinite regress looming, right? Because that raises the question of what makes that new record reliable? What makes my Polaroid photo reliable? Well, that needs to have started out in its own ready state. I can't have fed paper into the camera pre-printed. Okay, what makes that a bona fide ready state? Well, I need to have a memory of that paper having been fed in, not pre-printed, and so on. So the regress which looms is that each extra record we enlist to kind of assure the reliability of the previous record in the logic requires another, even earlier ready state. Right? We're on this kind of infinite regress. Now, the saving grace of this regress is that it eventually leads us to the earliest of all states, i.e. the past state, which allegedly terminates the regress. I'm going to come to that, why it might terminate that regress in a moment, but this is what they say. So what they call, because of this, Albert and Loewer refer to this ultimate ready state as the mother of all ready states, right? It's a good name for it. So how do we epistemically access this mother of all ready states? Yeah, I mean, we better have some means of epistemic access, otherwise it's no use to us, as we said earlier. Well, clearly not via records, because that would require an even earlier ready state. Remember, things documented with records need to be sandwiched between a present record and an even earlier ready state, and this is the earliest of all states, so that's no good. So Albert offers a different answer. Okay, get ready, buckle up, because this is a very Albert-y long sentence. Some crude, foggy, partly unconscious, radically incomplete, but nonetheless perfectly serviceable acquaintance with the consequences of the path hypothesis and the statistical postulate and the dynamical equations will very plausibly have been hardwired into the cognitive apparatus of any well-adapted biological species by a combination of natural selection and everyday experience and explicit study and God knows what else. So the idea is basically in order to we're not consciously aware of the past hypothesis. Obviously, we've been using records for much longer than we've been talking about the past hypothesis. But the idea is that some kind of dim acquaintance with it is built into us and plants and mushrooms and everything. Now, that's not actually as ridiculous as it sounds, because when you think about it, right, we are acquainted with the past, we and trees and anything that's been subject to natural selection is very, very familiar with the past frequencies of events, because those frequencies have hammered organisms into having kind of well-adapted wiring whereby they make appropriate responses to their environment, right? We, through our innate fears of, let's say, snakes and spiders, record and, we have ancestral records in us of past venomous attacks, for instance. right? So actually, this isn't as kind of, as mad as it might first seem. So my main objection is this, okay? Why does the past state end Albert and Loewer's regress? In other words, why is the past state fit to occupy this role of the mother of all ready states? Their answer is that given the current state today, okay, which is given current state today, which is a macro state, the past state, the fact that that obtained all the way back then, induces a distribution that ascribes a high probability to one common sense past macro history with Romans, dinosaurs and whatnot, but it doesn't have an analogous impact on the future. But let's just put that in different words. What they're saying is that the thing that makes the past state fit to be the mother of all ready states is that it induces this density asymmetry. It has the appropriate impact on the large-scale probabilistic structure of the world. It gives you this density asymmetry. Okay, so the density asymmetry bears huge explanatory weight in their picture because it's their rationale for thinking that it ends the regress. Okay, so what explains this density asymmetry? Which is what they need to do. To answer this, they've offered this thing that I call the bottleneck argument, and it's pretty much a purely entropic argument, and here's how it runs. The past state has a very low entropy. This is, by the way, echoed in quite a lot of their writings. It's not just these two words. It has a very low entropy, the past state. Okay, no one can disagree with that. Through standard statistical mechanical reasoning, right, that means that it occupies a tiny region of phase space. Yeah, like a tiny, tiny corner of phase space. Okay, fine. Well, what that means is that as we follow the possible microhistories that could describe the world backwards in time, and kind of following them backwards in our mind's eye, that means they get very, very bunched up. They become clustered in phase space as they approach the past state. Okay, that seems to make sense. But remember, if we're interested in accounting for explaining the density asymmetry, it's not actually microhistories that matter, it's macrohistories. And unfortunately, the explanation doesn't look very good when we convert this into deductions about macrohistories. It's also true, just as the past state has the lowest entropy of all, as we start moving backwards in time in our mind's eye, the universe's entropy gets lower in that temporal direction. It gets lower towards the past. Well, that means that through standard statistical mechanical reasoning, and similar to point 2 there, the possible macro states that the universe could have found itself in at those times will be smaller. The macro states will themselves get smaller as I approach the past state. But that means that the microhistories, which have become clustered as we follow them backwards, will tend to macroscopically diversify, because the kinds of macro states they'll find themselves in will be smaller targets in phase space. So the very considerations that they bring in to argue for a kind of clustering of microhistories as we go backwards, because the idea is that the past state is this really, really small target for them to hit. Well, if that's true, the kinds of macro states that they're going to enter into along that journey, they're also going to become smaller targets, which means that they're going to find themselves in very different macro states, more and more different macro states, the further back in time we go. So their consideration counts against what they want to prove, which is their density asymmetry, just as much as it counts for it. Now, it would be nice if, in order to rationalize a density asymmetry, in order to justify why there is one, they could just fall back on present records. It would be nice, in other words, for them, if they could go, all right, I can't derive a density asymmetry using just the comparative low entropy and therefore small volume of the initial state of the universe. Fine, but we've got all these records everywhere, you know, and they are making it one macro history probable. But they absolutely can't do that. That's circular. Because they, remember how this fits together, they want the bottleneck argument to explain the density asymmetry. The reason they want a density asymmetry is to prove that the past state is the mother of all ready states, which is their explanation for the record asymmetry. So they can't go and fall back on a record asymmetry in order to justify why there is a density asymmetry. Right? For them, that's absolutely off limits. Not for me, but we'll come to that later. So here's how it fits together. Right? Here's how the problem fits together. The bottleneck argument can't explain the density asymmetry, which is this large-scale probabilistic asymmetry. But the density asymmetry was their whole reason for accepting the past state to end their kind of weird regress. So that means that on their account, they can't explain the record asymmetry. Okay, so now we're on to part 3. What's another way of explaining the record asymmetry? Okay, well, records clearly reveal the update of mentaculous probabilities. Okay, they reveal the probability of events at other times. Can we capture this idea without enlisting the density asymmetry as they did? Well, we can. So there's this other tradition for explaining the record asymmetry, which appeals to something called the fork asymmetry. And this goes back to Reichenbach. It's what he called the common cause principle, okay, for reasons that have become clear. And here's what the fork asymmetry is. Whenever we've got two correlated events, A and B, there's always an earlier C that raises their chances and screens them off from each other, but never a later C that does the same. So let's imagine that C is like smoking, and A and B are cancer and yellow fingers. Well, the smoking raises the chance of cancer and yellow fingers, right? And it also has the property that, you know, if I say give, this is what the screening off thing means. If I conditionalize on someone having smoked, yeah, the probability of them having cancer and yellow fingers, they're going to be statistically independent, okay? So the idea is you've often got these kinds, so this is why Reichenbach calls it the common cause principle, because some people think that the C is like a cause of A and B. Okay, but I'm not going to talk about causation, I'm just talking about records. So we get lots of these structures, yeah, but we never get these structures. So it doesn't take a huge leap of the imagination to see that A and B kind of resemble records of C, right? You've got cancer and yellow fingers, and these are like records of smoking. You've got this past event whose probability is raised by many, many separate present events. And I'll say many, many separate events because there can be many more fork tips than just two, right? If I smoked, I might not just have cancer and yellow fingers. It might be, you know, damaged kidneys, damaged heart, you know, gum disease and whatever else. So that's the kind of standard way of looking at records, which is captures their kind of collective informativeness. I've got all these different discrete items which are all pointing to some single event in the past. But what's really interesting about records is their immense individual informativeness, right? Why is it that I can have like some, let's say like a photo and it can tell me so much information about the past? It's not like I always need many to learn about a past event in lots of detail. Well, I've argued in a previous paper in 2021 that we don't have to consider those fork tips, as I'll call them, as discrete events. We can actually consider them as subcomponents of a single record. So let's say big R is like that might be a photo, for instance, and C might be, I don't know, a seagull. Someone's taken a picture of a seagull. Well, the little r's here, they might actually be individual ink drops making up the picture. And if you think about it, those individual ink drops are going to have the same statistical relationship to each other and to the seagull as many different photos of the seagull. They're correlated with each other. The seagull raises all their probabilities of forming. And when I conditionalize on a seagull, or conditionalize on no seagull if it's a fake record, well then all of these ink drops are going to be statistically independent of each other. So we can actually apply this on a small scale to make sense of the individual informativeness of records. Okay, well, if the record asymmetry is explained by the fork asymmetry, well, then what explains that, and how does that link in with the whole mentaculus picture? Well, here I'm going to have quite a big sort of ellipsis. Many have derived the fork asymmetry, so people like Armsenius, Pearl, they've derived it from the statistical postulate, from the uniform initial distribution. But I don't really want to dwell on that. Okay, that's not really the point of this talk. What I want to give like a bigger picture of why this way of explaining the record asymmetry just has better chances than Albert and Loewer's. The main advantage is that by explaining the record asymmetry using the via the fork asymmetry, that's our kind of intermediary, and not via the density asymmetry, which was Albert and Loewer's intermediary, we don't need to rely on this dodgy bottleneck argument. Okay, we've derived records, in other words, from the initial state of the universe through a different channel, not relying on this large-scale probabilistic asymmetry. And here's what's nice. Once we've got our records, we can then help ourselves to all the records we want in order to explain why there's a density asymmetry. We don't have to worry about any circularity. We can explain the density asymmetry using our records because we didn't explain our record asymmetry using the density asymmetry. We did it via the fork asymmetry through a completely different route. But this approach actually has two further advantages. One of them, which I touched on, I can talk to you more about this in the questions, is that the fork asymmetry does much better than the ready state model, which is the whole thing of having recorded events sandwiched between present records and ready states. It does much better at capturing the actual content of records, and we saw that how it accounts. For one thing, it accounts for their individual informativeness. But here's another advantage. Unlike the ready state model, the fork asymmetry allows us to have new records of old events in accord with common sense, for instance, photos of the past state. So Albert and Loewer's account, this ready state model, says that the events we infer always have to be sandwiched between present record and a ready state. But when you think about it, that might seem plausible with like terrestrial events. I don't know, taking a picture of like a seagull. But it's actually completely untrue when you think about cosmology, for instance. When I take a photo of a long dead star, I clearly don't need to prepare my blank paper before the star existed. I just need to prepare it before the light comes into the camera. And it seems like a perfectly natural way to speak to call that a photo, not of light entering the camera. No, it's a photo of a long dead star, right? But their account forbids us from doing that. And actually, their account strictly forbids us from having records of the past state because we need this kind of blank paper, so to speak, to exist before the past state itself, like before the initial time of the universe, which makes no sense. But my account allows us to have photos of the past state directly. Now, if you think about like a photo of the CMB, right, or let's say like the Hubble Deep Field, you've got all these ancient stars and galaxies. It seems natural to think of that as a photo of the initial state of the universe, of the initial matter inhomogeneities that gave rise to these stars and galaxies being where they are. They can't make sense of that, but my account can make sense of that. It allows us to have it. And when you think about all the photos all around the world of all the different pictures of the Hubble the Hubble Deep Field, do they not seem like fork tips, all corresponding to the initial state of the universe as a fork point? And now think about all the individual pixels that make up all those copies of the Hubble Deep Field all around the world. Do they not also have the same statistical relationship to the initial state of the universe that the fork asymmetry describes? So the past state, if it's epistemologically unusual, it's not because we can't have records of it. We can have records of it, And yet it itself provides the metaphysical explanation of why those very records are reliable. That's what's interesting about the past state. So just to conclude, Albert and Loewer, they say that the initial state explains the density asymmetry, this large-scale probabilistic asymmetry, via the bottleneck argument, and that explains the record asymmetry. My criticism is that the initial state can't explain the density asymmetry. It can only do that if we start falling back on present records. But for them, they can't do that because that's circular. My view is that the initial state explains the fork asymmetry, that explains the record asymmetry, and that then explains the density asymmetry. So where we agree is that the initial state explains the record asymmetry via some sort of probabilistic time-asymmetric structure. Where we disagree is about what that explanatory intermediary is. They identify it as a global structure, the density asymmetry, whereas I identify it as a local structure, the fork asymmetry, which ultimately explains the global structure by aggregating together the sum total of what our records say. So in other words, they think that the large-scale probabilistic asymmetry explains the record asymmetry. I think a smaller scale probabilistic asymmetry, namely the fork asymmetry, does that job. And by lumping together the totality of what it says, that explains the large-scale probabilistic asymmetry. And that's it.
Thanks for that. Let's just say, I just sort of register like one concern and then ask a proper question. The one concern I just want to register is I think this is accurate to Loewer 2007. I don't think it's accurate to Albert, partly because when he's explaining the record asymmetry, it's not degree of informativeness. It's never about knowing more about the past and the future. It's just about there being a mechanism that works towards the past and not the future. So I just don't think he's relying on this density asymmetry that you seem to think he is. So, but let's not get into Albert interpretation. I'll just sort of mention it. Sorry. My question is about how entropy is going to be playing a role in your final account. Because as you noted, most people who are interested in the fork asymmetry think you can derive it from the statistical postulate alone, which means it's compatible with a universe that just hangs around at high entropy, which is, bizarre. So I presume we're not going that way because you mentioned entropy at the end. So, why I think that it's, given we're going to have this entropic asymmetry, why are you looking for something small and local to then build into a global asymmetry? Given you're going to have a global asymmetry in place, surely you could tell us something about that structure.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think I agree with you. I think you need to have the entropy kind of aspects is important, but I think that there's a kind of a division of explanatory work in terms of what the past hypothesis and the statistical postulate are doing. So I think what the past hypothesis does by giving you this entropic increase is it gives you a kind of a climate where pretty much anything at all interesting can happen. Otherwise, it's just like a kind of like a cold, thin soup forever. But then it's the fork asymmetry which does that extra kind of hurdle of explaining why there are such things like records. So I agree that the past hypothesis is the kind of foundation in order to have anything. And then,
my worry with this is that it's making it sound like the entropic, the past hypothesis or similar is giving you something generic and time-symmetric, namely there being interesting structure, whereas the statistical postulate is giving you the asymmetry part. Whereas I think it's precisely the reverse, and maybe this is a further discussion we could have, but one would have thought that the past hypothesis was the source of the asymmetries, and the statistical postulate was just, giving you a way of working with probabilities in this deterministic system.
Oh, the past hypothesis, it is giving you like an entropic asymmetry for sure, yeah. I mean, with this, you need the statistical postulate so I don't have some weird microstate that just stays their entropy forever, say. But yeah, I agree that the past state does most of the explaining in terms of why entropy goes up, but then kind of focusing on the fork asymmetry, that kind of helps illuminate why there are things like records. But I agree that it's the past hypothesis is, yeah, absolutely crucial to having this, the entropy asymmetry.
It's the link between the entropy and the fork asymmetry that I'm trying to press you on. That's.
Okay.
I mean, I don't want to take up too much time as well. So.
There's two in front of us, so we have time.
Yeah, do this quickly then.
Okay.
I mean, so Reichenbach might be a good case study here.
Yeah.
So Reichenbach, he did introduce this common cause fork asymmetry stuff. He took it to arise from a deeper entropic asymmetry. Namely, I mean, he has this thing about like causes and records being kind of the converse of each other. Essentially, when we're reasoning about the past, we're reasoning to kind of states of the system that would have been improbable given the system's behavior when isolated.
Yeah.
And it turns out, in his arguments, given that the universe is on an entropic slope, it's more likely we can use those kind of systems to infer towards the past and the future. So even Reichenbach is thinking of the fork asymmetry as like a special case of this broader entropic phenomenon.
Okay.
And I'm trying to kind of push you that direction and see how you feel.
If the fork asymmetry can be derived like more directly from an entropic asymmetry, even better. Even better. I'll be very happy with that. Yeah. I mean, at the moment, I kind of imagine them as it being as kind of like a little bit in parallel, and it was never completely. You've got like the second law here, and then you've got the fork asymmetry here. But if those can be kind of like melded into one, even better. Yeah. Phil, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So I wanted to ask, I don't think I totally understand your bottleneck argument, and the way that I loved your pictures, and the way that I think about the entropy or the regions and the macro regions and phase spaces, they start very small.
Yeah.
Where all the micro trajectories begin.
Yeah.
And then by now, much larger regions, that all the kind of remaining possible trajectories we could be.
Yeah.
And so as you go back, they do get smaller because that's what it is to go from a low entropy state to a large entropy state.
Yeah.
And so I think I missed, it seemed like you were saying as you go back in time, there were kind of more possible macro states. And I think I just missed something.
Okay, it's that not necessarily that there are more, it's that there's smaller targets. And so if I go back to this, I don't know how useful this drawing is actually in that question. I mean, they want to say, yeah, I'm not sure how useful.
You draw a picture even, because I was also just very confused by this.
Yeah, so in other words, okay, so they're saying, okay, so here's phase space. And there's the current macro state. And they're saying, so it's, let's say, uniform there. And they kind of impose that in the past. So they say, oh, well, that means that, look, they're becoming, okay, these are like possible microhistories. These are going like this. Yeah. But what's going to matter to the density asymmetry is as we start going this way, right, whether they're going to tend to find themselves in the same macro state. Yeah. And so they're going to, and so they want to say, well, look, these are kind of bundling up. So they're going to start hitting the same macro states more. But I'm saying that the macro states that they're going to be in, they themselves are going to get smaller. And as we start getting like here, they're going to get even smaller. And the extent to which it's believable that this thing here is going to lump them together like this, right, makes it that adds exactly the same level of intuition to the notion that the macro states here are going to be smaller, and they're therefore going to be hard targets for these micro states to hit. So the intuition, their intuition pumps as much water that way as it does in the other direction.
So is the idea supposed to be that you think it's more likely that they start in this initial very, very low entropy state and then diverge into different macro states and then kind of reconverge into the largest macro state?
I agree that there is a density asymmetry. I absolutely think that there is.
But that on their view,
that they can't make sense of it.
That this would happen rather than
not even more likely. It's just that the two intuitions count in the opposite direction. The thing that they bring in to support their point seems to count it against it in an equal measure. And given how important the bottleneck asymmetry is to their account, because their bottleneck asymmetry is their entire reason for thinking that the past state is the mother of all ready states. It's their entire, it's like the basis of their entire argument. And it seems like a very, very weak argument. So I agree that there is a density asymmetry, but I don't think that they can make good sense of it in their account.
Maybe
There's a point.
what might be going on here is sort of vacillating over whether we're conditionalizing on the past hypothesis or not. Because from their point of view, and whenever we're talking about the likely behavior of any of these trajectories starting off in the macro state now, we've conditionalized on the past hypothesis. So of course they're coming back to this relatively. So it, again, I was just confused in this in the same way Heather was. I mean, was the claim that, like, you know, here we are now and they kind of diversify and then reunify? Because for sure, by the time they get back to the past hypothesis, they're incredibly unified. Maybe there's one macro state.
Okay.
So it just seemed to us like there has to be a smooth kind of.
Right. Well, no, true. When you let's say when you get here, like this one here, that's true. I mean, they're going to have to absolutely reconverge at one point, right? Like, I don't know. Let's say there are two macro states there. I'm just keeping it simple. But most of the inferences that we make using records are not like 1 millimeter after the 1 millisecond after the Big Bang. Most of them, by a very, very long shot, you know, are within this, like there, not like here.
This is true, but I mean, the argument that it's diversifying can't be made just based on some broad features of the system, precisely because when we're conditionalizing on the past hypothesis, those broad statistical considerations are no longer in play. Things about micro trajectories heading out towards different macro states. There's no reason to, I mean, I agree about they need to justify their account more in various ways, but like an argument that micro trajectories tend to diversify doesn't work if we've conditionalized in the past hypothesis. You can't take the unconditional argument and just apply it in this case to expect trajectories to diversify.
But I mean, what if I agree that my argument isn't, my argument isn't completely concrete either. But I'm just basically throwing the same thing back at them.
I don't they need to justify more things. And
they're saying that this kind of clustering is happening because that thing's like a really, really small target, and so therefore that means that on the journey getting there, they're going to go like this in phase space. So I'm just basically just using their own argument, good or not, might be a bit crappy, but I'm basically just throwing it back at them, saying, well, that shows the exact opposite of what they want to say.
You can talk about.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Hi. Can I ask about the epistemology of records as you understand them? So I really like the idea that things that are in fact records are records of something which is a common cause in the Reichenbach sense.
Oliver, can you?
Yeah, sorry.
Close enough.
Hello?
There we go.
Right. So it's a question about the epistemology of records. So on the ready state model, if I know that the ready state obtained and I know the final state, then the conditional probability of the thing that it's a record of is very high. So I seem to know thereby that the thing that it's a record of obtained.
Yeah.
Now, I certainly I see the attraction of thinking that records will also involve several things that are have a common cause, and that's what they're a record of. But I didn't understand the epistemology. So how, from being aware of these things, do I get to know about the common cause?
Okay. I think what Albert and Loewer would say is that the information about ready states does need to reach us in some kind of a roundabout way. And then the reason we have information about those ready states is because we have this kind of roundabout information of other records. And so they need to kind of load us up and tell us a bit of a kind of, not a spooky story, because they, you know, but like a bit of a tenuous story about how this entire backlog of information reaches us.
I was buying that story. I saw that it, had a regress problem.
But assuming I did know by a record of past
Yeah.
obtained, then I know the thing that the record says obtained. I was asking what you say when
Okay.
you say records are these things that you explain as.
Okay. So that's just by observing correlations. Just by observing correlations between events. So I can notice that like A's and B's tend to be correlated. And then like when I conditionalize on my C's, then I find that the A's and B's are not correlated. It's just empirically in that way. So am I missing? I'm probably missing what you mean.
So, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, statistical observations might give me that these things are correlated.
Yeah.
So in the I'm looking at this picture of a seagull.
Yeah.
And so the knowledge that I'm relying on is that I see this particular pattern of pixels, or kind of bits on the photographic page.
Yeah.
And I have some kind of statistical knowledge that these correlations, well, that there are correlations involving statistical correlations involving these sorts of patterns.
Yeah.
And also that they can be screened off by a particular kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's okay. It's not as immediate and obvious as the ready state story.
The thing is, I agree that records do need to have started out in the right ready states, but I just don't need to use that fact in my argument, because the fact that things really do start in the right ready states is already assured by the fact that the relevant correlations, let's say between C's and A's and B's, like smoking and then cats, or seagulls and then photos, that those correlations really do obtain in the world at large. So I can kind of deal with a question of fake records, like, oh, what if the thing was pre-printed, that the photo was pre-printed, or what if the footprint was pre-stamped? Because, well, if most records, if that's how most footprints started out, so in other words, that's what most of those correlations involved, well then fake footprints wouldn't actually be fake footprints. That's just what footprints would actually be. They would just be these weird sand formations where they're just human foot shaped. So basically, I agree that things need to have started out in the right ready states, but I just don't need to kind of put that in by hand. It's guaranteed by the fact that the correlations, some correlations are actually in the world are real between Reichenbachian common causes and effects.
I have one follow-up. Did I miss anyone else?
Okay, so just to understand, are you assuming, but so you are relying on a particular empirical hypothesis on the way we recognize footprints or things like that?
On the way we recognize, sorry, I didn't.
Footprints and effects in general.
Yeah.
My question is, your talk is based on the fact that you are assuming a particular empirical.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why don't you consider the fact that we identify the relation between causes and effects in terms of the way we act? Because this seems to be, from the cognitive science, the most plausible explanation of the identification of causation. So we act a certain way, and this allows us to discriminate between what is a cause and what is an effect.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to kind of shy away from calling it Reichenbach's common cause principle, because I don't want to commit to the notion that it's not actually how I think about causation. It's just an intuitive way of thinking it of looking at that structure. It's like, oh, I've got this seed event and it kind of spawns all these later things. But yeah, I want to kind of distance myself from the idea that that is what happens in causation. Yeah.
Okay. So you are not really relying on a particular theory? No,
not at all. Not of causation. No. I think that it's counterfactuals, yeah.
Okay. Just
Me again. So when you talked about like how do we actually go about, you know, like maybe we don't have records, and I think it's a really good objection to the mentaculus that like I didn't have a record of the beach, you know, being clean before the footprint and all of that. So there's got a lot, you got to build in a lot of what like ready state means and how we have access to those. But I do think there's this kind of similar puzzle for you with the common cause, right? Like if you're like, oh, look, we can see all these correlated records of the Big Bang, but of course we don't know how to screen off like the Big Bang, right? Like how do we, so I'm just wondering like if you have a similar kind of like, yeah, sure, in ordinary cases you can control for smoking or not and see the results, but like for a lot of other things, especially your kind of nice cases. I was just wondering how you thought about this.
So the relevance of the screening off aspect. So let's say if I, where is it? If I go back to the forks here, the relevance of the screening off, what it basically does, it's not really the screening off per se. It's what the screening off means is that I can actually have a whole cluster of A's, B's, and other ones, and they all kind of collectively point to this. Now, when I have something like this, where I don't have the screening off condition, because let's say asbestos, smoking, cancer, when given that someone has cancer, when I discover that they were working with asbestos, it actually lowers the probability that they were a smoker, because it's like I've already accounted for their cancer. So I don't have the same kind of like cluster of events here, which denote something in the future. Whereas I do have a cluster of things which denote something here. So you're right, we can't control for something like, you know, the past hypothesis. But what we can say is that we can say, all right, well, a past state, that is the kind of thing that would raise the chances of all these later things. All these later, let's say, photos of the CMB, or pixels within photos of the CMB. So that's how we can infer that. That's what justifies saying that that's the initial state, and that's all about photos of the initial state. That's how we could rationalize that.
So would it be fair to say you're going to rely in probably a similar way that they might on like, you know, causal models or, you know, some Pearl graph or something about interventions and what you would imagine the screening conditions are based on a bunch of other broader theories? Because we can't actually, of course, do this.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry again. This might be some of the stuff that Oliver was picking up on. I'm not sure, but so I find it helpful to distinguish between the project of explaining why we know more about the past versus explaining our mechanism of records. And it's tempting to say, like, look, in a situation where, you know, you try and set it up very artificially so that there's like one so-called record, you know, you want to say the fork asymmetry is not really in play, but, you know, say you know enough about like C's and A's and you've observed them lots of times, you can still use A to reason to C, even if you haven't got a fork asymmetry, you're already kind of screening off. And, you know, arguably an entropic account can kind of handle those kind of cases because your entropic asymmetry is still there, of course. But the worry is that you're sort of, in fork asymmetry versions, kind of helping ourselves to a bunch of observed correlations that we're used to, which, you know, they do involve screening off and all that, but maybe what's doing the work here is just the relation between C and A, and B is just kind of helpful for additional reasoning about C.
So here's where I would say that actually, in a lot of those kinds of cases, there is actually a B as well. In fact, there are like zillions of Bs. And it's like, let's say, I don't know, there's, so Albert and Loewer's example of the rolling billion rule, or something like that. Well, actually, I think, there's the C is the person breaking the triangle, and the A is like this, the 8-ball rolling along. But the 8-ball is made of lots of subcomponents. The 8-ball is made of lots of components within the ball, and that's all of these.
I'm sorry, I might be using up some.
It's like the photo example.
It's going to break into different. That's so nice. It's going to break into different cases, you know. So if it's like it's literally down to like individual particles, no, you can know nothing about where the particle came from just from like its location now. But, you know, if you build into sort of nice self-standing records, then sure. But then you're in the situation I'm describing where it just explains why you have more knowledge of the past, not knowledge of the past in general. Mm-hmm. And I don't think you can always break down records sort of to the micro level and still get the story to work.
That's interesting. I'm thinking individual particles, bubble chamber. No, I think I need to think about that more for sure. Yeah. Thank you.
We have time for one more question if someone wants.